Bloodline Ravens Hollow was the kind of town that felt like a relic of the past. Tucked away in a valley surrounded by an endless expanse of dense forest, it was the sort of place where everyone knew your name and your secrets. Yet, the Ward family was different. They lived in the oldest house in town, perched on the edge of the forest like a silent sentinel, watching over generations of mysteries. For Sarah Ward, the house was more prison than home. Her parents were cold, speaking to her only in commands or vague warnings. Don't go into the forest. Stay away from the attic. Don't ask questions. Sarah often wondered what they were so afraid of, but after years of dead-end answers, she stopped asking. That changed one rainy afternoon when Sarah stumbled upon the journal. She'd been poking around in the attic, a place her parents always told her to avoid. It was dark and musty, filled with forgotten relics of the family's past. She tripped over a stack of old boxes, and as she steadied herself, her eyes landed on a worn leather book, half buried under a dusty sheet. The name on the cover was unfamiliar, Eleanor Ward. Flipping through the pages, Sarah felt an eerie chill crawl up her spine. The handwriting was messy and uneven, growing more frantic with each entry. It started innocently enough, mentions of family gatherings, weather updates, and daily routines. But then the tone shifted. The journal spoke of a curse, one that had plagued the Ward family for centuries. Each generation, a single member was chosen as the keeper of the bloodline, tasked with maintaining a dark legacy. The entries described rituals performed under the light of the full moon, voices calling from the woods, and an unspoken rule: the blood must stay pure, beware the outsider. Sarah couldn't stop reading. Eleanor's last entries were almost illegible, scrawled in shaky handwriting. She wrote of being watched, of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, and of something ancient lurking in the forest. Her final words sent a shiver through Sarah. "They're coming for me. I don't want to go. I don't want to be the keeper." That night, Sarah had her first nightmare. In the dream, she was standing in the forest surrounded by towering pines that seemed to press closer with every breath. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. Ahead of her, a clearing appeared, bathed in the cold, silver light of the full moon. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, dark and stained. Surrounding it were hooded figures, their faces obscured by shadows. They chanted in a language she couldn't understand, their voices low and rhythmic. She felt herself being pulled toward the altar, her feet moving on their own. On its surface lay a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. As she reached for it, her fingers trembling, one of the figures turned toward her. Beneath the hood was her mother's face, cold, emotionless, and hollow. Sarah woke up drenched in sweat, her hands clutching her sheets. The dream felt too real, the images burned into her mind. The following days were filled with unease. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, and Sarah often felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Her parents were acting stranger than usual, their conversations cut short whenever she entered the room. One evening, Sarah confronted them. "What's going on?" she demanded, slamming the journal onto the dining table. "What is this? Who was Eleanor, and what's the bloodline?" Her mother paled, her hands trembling as she reached for the journal. "Where did you find this?" "In the attic," Sarah said. "Why does it matter? You've been hiding something, haven't you?" Her father's voice was cold and firm. "You shouldn't have gone up there." "Why?" Sarah shot back. "What are you so afraid of?" Her mother looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "You don't understand, Sarah. It's not a choice. It's your duty." "My duty?" Sarah scoffed. "I don't want anything to do with this." But neither of them answered. They simply turned away, leaving Sarah more confused and angry than ever. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah made a decision. Clutching the journal, she slipped out of the house and into the forest. The air was cold, the full moon casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Despite her fear, she felt an invisible force pulling her forward, guiding her deeper into the woods. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a clearing. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the clearing from her dream. The stone altar stood at its center, the stains on its surface darker than she remembered. Before she could process what was happening, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to see her parents stepping out of the shadows, their faces blank and lifeless. Behind them came more figures, neighbors, distant relatives, and strangers she didn't recognize. "Sarah," her mother said, her voice monotone. "You've come." "What is this?" Sarah demanded, backing away. Her father stepped closer. "It's your turn, Sarah. You've been chosen as the keeper of the bloodline. It's time to fulfill your role." "No!" Sarah shouted. "This isn't real. It's insane." "The blood must stay pure," her mother said. "You cannot run from this." The figures surrounded her, their chanting growing louder. Cold hands gripped her arms, dragging her toward the altar. Sarah struggled, her screams echoing into the night, but it was no use. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, Sarah was forced to her knees before the altar. The knife was placed in her hands, its weight cold and unforgiving. "The bloodline must continue," her father said, his voice devoid of emotion. The last thing Sarah saw was the moonlight glinting off the blade and the shadows rising around her like living things. When the sun rose, the clearing was empty. The altar stood silent, its surface clean. Sarah Ward was never seen again, but the people of Raven's Hollow spoke in hushed tones of strange sounds coming from the forest, whispers on the wind, and the distant cry of a young woman. The Ward house grew darker and quieter, its windows forever shadowed. On nights of the full moon, some say you can still hear the chanting in the woods, a reminder that the bloodline's curse is far from over.